I'm Alex Gupta with UATV. Today I'm speaking with Mr. Eric Hontz. He is a program manager for Eurasia at the Center for International Private Enterprise in Washington, D.C. Hello, Mr. Hontz. Welcome back to UATV.
Hi, Alex. Good to be here.
Last time we spoke in February, you were discussing privatization in Ukraine and corporate governance. Could you give us an update on privatization and corporate governance since then?
Sure, Alex. We spoke a bit about the privatization, or the attempted privatization of the Odessa Portside plant. Since that time, there's been another attempt to privatize, which also failed. And it's really not surprising. The government lowered the price to $200 million and still failed to attract any investors. And this is a problem that's going to be endemic with any attempted privatization of large state-owned enterprises in Ukraine. There are claims and counterclaims by a large number of Ukrainian oligarchs and a weak system of rule of law in Ukraine. So as an investor, I'd be very hesitant to make an offer of several $100 million on an asset that could be contested in court for years.
So you have the Odessa Portside plant, which is a fertilizer plant, I believe, near Odessa, that the government's trying to privatize, but they just cannot find bidders, correct?
Yeah, and so that goes back to the underlying point of strengthening corporate governance at these state-owned firms as a first step towards privatization. There's an unresolved claim of debt from Mr. Kolomoisky or one of his companies. And there's also some interests or some unclaimed or unresolved issues with Mr. Firtash. And so those two oligarchs are really, whether they want to or not, they're interfering with the privatization of this very large asset.
So any sophisticated buyer would like to own this plant, but you have all these claims and they'll probably be locked up in litigation for many years if they were to purchase it, yes?
Yeah, and so you know, if you're an investor, you want to put your money to work as fast as possible. I don't want to, sit in court for years. I want to invest my money and earn a return on that money as quickly as possible. And if there are claims against the plant that might be resolved in court, adverse to my interests, that's a risk that I don't think that I'm willing to take as an investor that can afford to invest several $100 million into Ukraine, which is a significant amount of money.
Are there a lot of businesses in Ukraine which are similar to this and that people don't want to buy them because they could risk being locked up in litigation for many years?
Yeah, so the top 100 state-owned enterprises account for something around 90% of all of the revenue in the country. And so those very large state-owned enterprises have various connections with some of the large oligarchs in the country. And, you know, without, you know, even if these oligarchs were to exert influence or wanted to exert influence one way or the other, they're still going to have a role. And as a Western investor into Ukraine, with a weak rule of law and a weak judiciary that could be manipulated, I would be hesitant to enter into any of these large transactions. Where I think that there's more promise for privatization is the small and medium-sized sector of state-owned enterprises.
Have you seen an improvement in the rule of law since you've been working in Ukraine?
I've seen a lot of speeches and a lot of attempts. So the judicial reforms that are going on right now, they take time, right? Judiciary is not rebuilt overnight. And, you know, we have to be patient with the rebuilding of the judiciary. The system was simplified, going from four levels to 3 this past year. And there's a new process and tests for judges. So, yes, there is improvement, but at the same time, you know, investors are not very patient people, and neither is the Ukrainian public, quite frankly.
Have you write a lot about corporate governance. What is the link between sound corporate governance and privatization, accelerating privatization?
So yeah, we deal a lot in the former Soviet Union with firms, small and medium-sized enterprises primarily, and the issue of corporate governance. So corporate governance, by improving corporate governance and compliance, really has two primary effects, particularly at the small and medium-sized enterprise level. The first effect is that you can more easily participate into international supply chains. That's you can get a contract from Coca-Cola for bottling, or you can participate in Dannon's supply chain network. And the second effect is that owners of these small and medium-sized enterprises can realize the full value of their business if they do have strong corporate governance and compliance programs in place. That means, the way that business has traditionally been done in the former Soviet Union is through relationships and not necessarily through contracts and the rule of law. And so if your entire valuation of your business depends upon one or two key relationships, you're never going to fully realize the value of your business in its sale. So if you're a small and medium-sized businessman and on paper your business is worth $3 or $4 million, but your entire business rests on the relationship that you have with a regulator, you're never going to be able to realize that value. So it really doesn't exist. With improved corporate governance and compliance, we're saying that these businesses can be sold to other business people and other investors more easily, and these business owners can realize the full value of their business.
I wanted to ask you, last time we talked about the state property fund. We see the state property fund, we see the head of the state fiscal service was arrested. Has the state property fund, has the state fiscal service, are they making improvements?
Again, there's a lot of talk and some action, but it remains to be seen. I don't think that they haven't done anything demonstrable that would increase the level of trust, either by international investors, international institutions, or I think by the Ukrainian public itself.
What do you think needs to happen to have this talking stop and actually implementation take place?
I think small steps, right? I think perhaps the government should really show where they want to go. Pick a couple of small examples. The IMF has done a really good program on improving corporate governance at Naftogaz Ukraine, and that's probably the gold standard of corporate governance at a state-owned enterprise currently in Ukraine. But that program is just one company, right? But that's a start, and you have to start somewhere. So if the government were to telegraph that we're going to move into the agribusiness sector, and we're going to make sure that any state-owned enterprise that's affiliated with the agribusiness sector is fully compliant with international norms, can participate in international markets, and has a robust compliance program, that would be a step in the right direction. You can't do everything at once. So my personal strategy, if I were sitting in the Ukrainian government, would be to take off a small piece and then start working from there and building trust from some sort of base.
Is privatization, is that part of the deal with the IMF, their loan package?
So yeah, it's the IMF is encouraging more rapid privatization. But look, over the past 3 years, all the easy reforms are done. Right? You're running into the tough stuff now. So the four main reforms that I see are privatization, land reforms, and pension reforms. And so you have very large, very powerful blocks within each of these reforms that are opposing reforms. So the pension system in Ukraine is at a 1-to-1 ratio, and that's just not sustainable. So there's one worker for every one pensioner. Land reforms, there's massive political questions, and after the privatization in the 1990s and some awkward privatizations subsequent to the 1990s, if I'm a small landholder in Ukraine, I'm going to have very little faith in the government that they have my best interests in mind when they privatize land. And with land privatization, you have to simultaneously develop a financial system that will allow for lending to be made on land. And the last one, privatization, coming back to that, there's a lot of, shall we say, corruption networks that exist within state-owned enterprises. And these networks of corruption have very powerful, very vested interests. We saw through the e-declaration system that the 432 or 23 members of the Rada declared over $500 million in assets. This is in a country with an average salary of $200 a month.
Wow. Before we run out of time, I really wanted to ask you about the banking sector here in Ukraine. We're hearing a lot about insolvent banks. What is the state of the banking sector in Ukraine, and how should it be improved?
Yeah, so Hontz, the National Bank of Ukraine, and Hontz really did a good job in cleaning up the banking sector. You had, the takedown of Privatbank not too long ago, which was successful. I mean, I think it was 1/3 of deposits, something like that, in Ukraine. And they successfully transitioned it to state control without a major run on deposits. That's a success story anywhere in the world. And the National Bank has been closing down these banks that existed primarily for the benefit of certain oligarchic interests, where they would collect money from the people to bankroll their own private enterprises. So there has been some consolidation. There has been some closures of banks, but I think that more needs to be done, and Ukraine isn't completely out of the woods yet. At the same time, I know that the Ukrainian government has a very large interest in stabilizing the financial sector, particularly prior to those land reform questions, as I mentioned earlier.
Well, thank you so much for joining us again, Mr. Hontz. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for your time.
All right. Have a good day.
You too. Bye-bye.
I'm Alex Gupta with UATV. I was speaking with Mr. Eric Hontz. He is the program manager for Eurasia at the Center for International Private Enterprise in Washington, D.C.